What's up, gentlemen? This is Rising Phoenix Podcast, a podcast about how to rise up after your divorce. I'm your host, divorce coach Michael Rhodes. Let's get into it. Joining me today is Dr. Stan Goldberg. Dr. Goldberg, why don't you just jump right into it and tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, my original training is in the area of speech language pathology. I did that for 30 years until I developed some physical problems that forced me to retire. So my history of loss and grief go back many years. After I retired, I became a bedside hospice volunteer. I did that for 8 years and learned probably more about loss and grief through the patients I served than anything in my own background. Um, I started writing on various issues on aging, including uh, grief and loss, but also acute and chronic illnesses. Never wrote on divorce, never experienced divorce, but came close.
Mm.
And recently, I've been asked by Psychology Today online to write on these issues for them. So I'm doing that. My new book is called Preventing Senior Moments, which, if your viewers have no need for it yet, they will shortly. And that's basically who I am.
Nice. Well, thank you for joining me. And as with many guests on the podcast, I found you on psychologytoday.com, and wrote about grief. And so, as I like to do on the podcast, is I like to define things. And I know this is probably a simple one to define, but what is grief? How do you define it?
Actually, it's complex. It's not simple. I think the mistake that many psychologists and counselors make is making it too simple. For me, grief is it's the loss of a significant emotion or part of one's identity.
Mm.
Now that's a lot different than what you'll hear from many counselors. And the reason that I came to that definition had to do with expressions of grief that I saw, not only in my hospice patients, but in a lot of clients, and the question then became, well, is there something that pulls together the grief one suffers from the loss of a spouse of 50 years and the loss of a pet that you've had for 3.5 months? What is it about that produces the same grief? When I wrote an article about that in Psychology Today, that I think I got the most hostile comments I ever had from any article I wrote,
Wow.
um, because I maintained that there was no hierarchy of grief,
Mm.
that essentially grief is grief. And the legitimacy of someone who is grieving, let's say, the loss of a relationship, is identical to the grief that, or can be identical to the grief that one experiences from the loss of a parent or a child. Well, that just blew up the internet. But but it's true. And I think the reason that I believe that has to do with the way that I look at grief. I'll give you a very good example. When I stopped teaching, uh, one activity that I enjoyed most of anything I ever did was wilderness fly fishing,
Mm.
where I would go off by myself for a week, 2 weeks, fly fish, and it was just marvelous. I couldn't do that afterwards, and when I couldn't, I end up grieving the loss of that activity as if I had lost a child. Now, of course, I probably would have my own hierarchy of my children and my wife.
Sure.
But that was right up there, and I was trying to understand why and
Mm.
what it was that I was going to do with the rest of my life at that point. And I thought about, what was I grieving? What was it that I really missed? And the first thought was, well, standing in the middle of a pristine stream with nobody around, stalking these wild trout, and that's what I loved.
Mm.
And I thought about it. I thought, well, is that really what I loved about it, or was it the emotion that that activity gendered? And that's when I had my eureka moment. That was it. That's what pulls together, I think, various forms of grief. And if you're looking at what determines the depth of grief,
Mm.
there's three things, or actually two things basically. One is how important the loss is to your identity. You know,
Mm.
for me, not being able to fly fish alone in the wilderness was significant.
Yeah.
I was no longer that person anymore. So that's one. And the second, besides identity, is the importance of the emotion that was lost. You know,
Mm.
my mother was inconsolable when my father died. And one of the reasons for that was for 30 years, they ran a supermarket, not a super, a grocery store
Mm.
together. And they were with each other 7 days a week. They
Mm.
worked with each other 6 days a week. So the relationship was significant for her. And when he died, a good part of her identity was also lost. And I
Mm.
think the same thing is true when people go through a divorce.
Oh yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, I have very good friends who a week after the divorce, they were elated. You know, they were having a wonderful time. And I've had others that grieved and are still grieving 10 years after the divorce. And I think a lot of that has to do with those two elements. What is the emotion that was lost, and how does it affect one's identity? So
Yeah.
my notion is a little different than traditional psychology, counselors.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I would agree 100%. I think the big one is the identity for a divorce. I think obviously their emotion is a part of it. What you get from the time with your family and your spouse, and because you don't only lose a spouse, so to speak. You also lose a family if you have children. And then you lose them in at least half the time or whatever custody schedule works out. But I'm curious to get your thoughts on um, what I guess it. I think I kind of answered it myself in my own head, but I want to get your take on it. What is the difference between people's depth of grieving? Like, so some guys go through divorce and it doesn't seem to bother them very much. They're probably not listening to this podcast because they probably don't feel like they need to. And that could be a whole host of things, denial or avoiding it or whatever. But some folks are devastated for years, like you said, and someone loses a pet and they're devastated, and someone does and it doesn't affect them. Is it? I mean, I think identity is probably a huge part of that, but is there anything else that sort of factors into that
Yeah.
equation? What?
No, I think that's an excellent question, because I think we have a choice to grieve or not to grieve. It
Mm.
sounds a little nutty, probably, to some people, but we make that choice. If Give you an example, I have friends who have been grieving the loss of a relationship for 15 years,
Mm.
you know, and for 15 years, they have the analogy is remaining on the sideline of a dance hall. You're sitting there and you're watching the world go by, you're watching other people, and you, for whatever reason, sometimes legitimate and sometimes not, you're sitting there and you're not engaging. I think, choosing not to grieve is difficult.
Mm.
It's a hard process. I think that for some counselors, what they suggest is you just wait. You wait until, you're ready. You know, when someone mentioned that to my mother, and they said, well, don't worry about it. It just takes time. With time, you'll get over it.
Right, right.
And I was furious, and she said, there isn't enough time in the universe to get over my loss.
Yeah.
And I think that's what a lot of people feel. And that can gets you to the point of inaction. You feel that you just can't do it and you're
Mm,
just going to wait. And, I think that what I've experienced when I've counseled people is that when someone suffers a loss, there is a period of time when they should not make any decisions. It's almost as if you drop a stone in the middle of a pond and you watch these ripples and
mm,
they start off very big and they eventually calm down. So, my advice usually is don't make any major decisions, when you suffer a loss, regardless of what that loss is. But when things seem to be a little calm, that's when you need to make a decision.
mm,
Am I going to grieve what I've lost, believing I can never recover this? Or am I going to start searching for something?
mm.
And it's those two variables, I think, that make a difference of, whether someone starts to end their grieving and also how successful they can be.
Yeah. So, I mean, that begs the question because, you mentioned it and we hear it all the time. I hear it all the time. So, in addition to this, I run a Facebook support group and there's a lot of men in there. And that is some of the advice that is thrown around. It gets better with time. Um, does time heal grief?
No.
Right.
Flat out no.
Yeah.
To me that implies there's something magical
Right.
about waiting. I've never found that to be true. I'm much more active, and I encourage people to be active. I mean, you can do traditional talk therapy if
Sure.
you have enough money and enough time and enough patience, and you might get through your grief after 3, 4, 5 years of psychotherapy. Or you can take a more active role and say, let me think about what I can do to change this. And that's where I am. So for me, it involves very specific steps.
Mm,
And the first one is understand what grief is. What
mm,
does it mean to grieve? So I mentioned earlier that that first step is understanding you're not grieving a specific person, behavior, skill. You're grieving the emotion that generated.
mm,
If you understand that,
mm,
then you go into the next step, which is saying, okay, what is that emotion that I lost?
yeah.
When my wife left me, for some crazy guy down the street, and I know she's not coming back.
Yeah.
What did I lose?
Mm,
Why am I so upset?
yeah.
Okay. You identify what that is, and then you go to the third step. And then you say, okay, what can replace not her, but what can replace the emotion?
Mm,
And quite often, the replacement has absolutely nothing to do with what was lost. Give you another example. Going back to my example about wilderness fly fishing. I was utterly depressed for a few years because this was a significant loss. I
mm,
was a different person. My needs, were not being met. And I started thinking about what was it about fishing, that kind of fishing,
mm,
that was so enjoyable. And I realized it was serenity. That's what I was missing. I was missing the serenity of being alone. So the question then became, if that's what I was missing, how could I regain it?
mm.
Physically, I couldn't do that anymore. I couldn't,
Right.
but was there something that would produce serenity in me? And I found it. I didn't find it in fishing. I didn't find it, in another person. I found it in crafting wood flutes and playing them.
Mm,
It had nothing to do with fishing, but you can do that. And I've worked with clients who've done the same kind of thing. It's like once you identify the emotion, you'd be amazed the number of things that could regenerate it. And so what you do then, and we're still in that third step, you now have a list of things that you feel might be able to generate that emotion. And then you go to the fourth, which is you actually experiment. You do the
mm.
things.
Yeah, yeah. So how long did it take you to find your next thing? So from the end of fly fishing to making the flutes, what was that time period? And then how did you or how many roughly how many things did you try? Like how did you get from that to that?
I think it was a relatively short period of time. The difficulty was identifying the emotion,
Mhm.
and it's almost like, if you understand why you're sorrowful, then it becomes pretty easy to figure out what can also create it. So for me, I tried a number of different things, different activities, different organizations, and nothing felt right until, I picked up this piece of bamboo and I started putting holes in it and the sound came out and I thought, not bad. This
Mhm.
feels right.
Yeah.
And I kept doing that, and I'm still doing it now. Now, I'm not in, I don't want, your listeners to think that I believe you can replace all losses equally by anything you find. It's not true, you know. But what you can do is you can minimize the pain that you're feeling by becoming very active in searching for something that will give you joy in your life.
Yeah, it's I wholeheartedly agree. And I think that was part of my journey was it was doing stuff, was finding trying things to heal. A lot of it was therapy and books and that kind of stuff, but and then eventually it led me to this kind of stuff. But I think that it's a critical piece and component of moving on, of healing, things of that nature. And it can take a toll, and it can be difficult to get that inertia, right? It's that you're so depressed and just miserable. I mean, there's so many adjectives that are accurate. It's a tough time in life, and so it can be hard. But I think once you start down that path, it's like anything. Once you start it, Tony Robbins talks about this, where it's hard to start, to get a rocket. Up out of the atmosphere, but once it's in space, it's a lot easier, and almost all things sort of that's applicable to, like, at the beginning of something is very hard, but it's important, to put that effort in. Something just hit me. I wanted to sort of switch topics a little bit because I didn't know that you did hospice, and so that sort of got me thinking about what you experienced doing that. I'm guessing you probably seen a lot of folks that were at the tail end of their lives.
Yeah, interesting about the hospice movement in the United States. Most hospice facilities will take people in if a doctor certifies they have 6 months or less to live.
Okay, so
But
my
but
question is, what
but
it
that's not what happens. That's
oh,
not what
oh,
most people do not want to go to hospice because they really don't understand it. So you're looking at usually 2 months or two to 3 weeks of someone's life. So
oh my God.
that's most of the people that I dealt with had 2 to 3 weeks left to
Okay,
live.
so that I mean, I have a question, but it just that kind of blows my mind. The A that you that there's anybody, but you volunteered to experience those things. But I'm curious to know, you probably had a lot of conversation with these folks. If you could boil it down, one or two or three or whatever, like, what are some of the things that people sort of focused on at the end? Like, what is, regrets, or were they just reflecting, or like, what's the mindset of someone that is going through something that, listen, divorce is really fucking hard, but ooh, buddy, dying is like, that's another level. So what are some of the things that you've seen from people that are going through that?
Well, it was interesting. It would take days to go through the whole process of
Sure.
how I got to hospice. But when I started in hospice, I was working on a book, and I kept working on it. But every day I was at hospice, it's like there was a new story that was told to me or a new lesson, and I just would write them down, and I say, well, I'll just put them away. I'm not going to deal with them, and it eventually became a book, and it was a memoir of my service as a hospice volunteer.
Mm.
And in there were, again, my memory is going. It was either seven, I better look here, 7 or 8 lessons.
Hmm.
Okay, so the book is called Lessons for the Living.
Hmm.
Oh, I guess I should hold it up over here. Well, it's not going to work that way.
Yeah.
It's lessons for the living, stories of forgiveness, gratitude, and courage at the end of life.
Hmm.
So in there are, say 7 lessons. And the number of times I'm asked, what are the most important ones?
Hmm.
And I rethink about it. And every time I'm asked that question, it's almost as if I'm going back to that hospice facility. And there were a couple that just stand out more than anything. And I think probably because they pertain more to myself. And that's why I can identify. The first one, and I think is one of the most important, is don't wait. Just simply don't wait. Think about all of the times you wanted to share how you felt with someone, or with your wife, your ex-wife, your girlfriend, your boyfriend, you know, and you said, well, I'll have time later. And later never came. It could be that the relationship ended. It could be that someone died, but you waited. And what I found from my patients, those that waited, and again, they waited for many different things, but when they waited, they had incredible regrets as they came to the end of their life. So, you find this natural transition. Well, people will look at what they've done their entire life and look back on it. Sometimes the last day that they're alive, they'll look back on it and think, what if I had done it differently?
Hmm. Hmm.
One of the things that we tried to do with our patients was to help them resolve those issues. So those that waited too long, we tried to get them to ask for forgiveness from people that they offended or be forgiven by someone who uh, did something terrible to them. And the cleaner one's plate is at the end of your life, the more peaceful the death.
Hmm.
So don't wait.
Yeah. I mean, I think, loss and grief. I lost my father a long time ago. These are obviously tough topics and I think when you reflect on things like the loss of a person, a parent, um, child, goodness, I don't know. I wouldn't be able to handle that one, honestly, but it, it puts things in a little bit in perspective and I think that's important sometimes to be able to, and it's not, I mean, it feels kind of cheap to be like, well, I'm alive or, my kids are alive or, but it's not because I think the ultimate loss is life. Right. And at least we're still here. Yes, we're hurt and we're grieving and we're wounded and it sucks really, really bad, but we do have breath in our lungs. And I think it's important sometimes and I didn't know that. I think this is just perfect. I didn't know that you had done that stuff. So I think it's just perfect. I think it's important to sometimes count our blessings, if that's the right way to say it, because it could be that we're no longer here. And as much as this really sucks, I think that would be worse.
I'm going to jump in here and just switch it a little bit.
Sure.
Uh, looking at at discussions of thinking, yes, but and which happens a lot in
Sure.
loss, you know, and that I've never found that to be very helpful.
No.
The yes but argument, yes, you lost your relationship, but just think of everything else that you have a wonderful
Right.
uh a bank account, you have a good job, and the assumption is that that's going to be that's a form of compassion, a form of
Mm.
helping someone be realistic, but it doesn't work. It just doesn't. um and it's like saying to them, it, it's almost as if you're trying to deny the legitimacy of the
Mm,
feeling that they're having. And my approach is I never say that to people. I never say, but look,
mm,
you are grieving a loss regardless what it is, and it is legitimate, so let's do
sure.
something about that, rather than saying maybe all the good things in their life is going to compensate, because sometimes it doesn't.
Yeah, no,
And
I don't disagree. I think the loss of life is a pretty heavy one to say that at least I'm alive and breathing. But I get what you're saying for sure. I'm sure that people that are grieving the loss of a life probably like for me when my dad died, I am sure I didn't want someone to be like, well, hey, you're in the Navy, you're serving your country. I probably would have been pretty pissed about that, for sure. But and I think you're right. I think there is a tendency to sometimes um, do that kind of avoidant for people, right? It's an avoidance strategy where it's like we want to look at everything else but the grief and the pain, and I think that is detrimental and not helpful. Um, but I do think that sometimes it's okay, I think, to at least count our blessings because
oh, sure.
this is a difficult path, this whole divorce thing. I want to know, like, how did you? I mean, I have it's tough for me when and of course they're my animals, but when my animals pass, it's a very difficult time for me. How did you deal with this constant loss of folks that you were helping? I'm assuming there was some detachment because you didn't know them, maybe, but how did you manage that? I don't know that I could do that. I mean, kudos to you for doing
Uh,
it.
there, there was no detachment. It was always attachment. And I think that's what prevents burnout. There's this whole thing in the medical community where nurses and doctors are taught not to get attached to your patients.
Right,
And by doing that, you won't, you'll at least you'll go home and you'll be fine.
right,
Well, you know, talk to anybody in hospice and they'll laugh at that statement.
right.
That is the surest way of leaving, of getting detached, of feeling that you don't want to be there. Every day I was in hospice and I left the bedside of a patient. I did this for 8 years.
Mm,
I said to them, thank you for allowing me to share in your life.
mm.
You would not believe it. And anyone who's listening now who was involved in hospice is probably shaking their heads with me. The honesty that is expressed by people who are dying is mind blowing.
Mm.
You will learn more about the world, about yourself, by just being at the bedside of someone who knows they're dying. That is a very powerful experience. I felt joyous every day that I left the hospice, from the interactions I had, from knowing what I was able to do for my patients, from learning from them. I mean, the stories in my book about, people's lives were ones that were shared willingly with me. And it was joyous. Yeah. Of course I was, devastated when someone actually died, but I was able to look at the time we had together as being meaningful to both of us. And it helped them die easier and it helped me live better.
Was that an evolution? Did you have to get to that, or did you start out like that?
From my very first night. When I trained, it was like 40 hours of training. This
Mm,
was at the Zen Hospice Center, which is a very well-known place in San Francisco, and they've closed for a while now.
mm,
But the first night was going to be Thanksgiving,
so,
and they asked if anybody would be willing to work that night, so the other people who've been doing it for a while would have the day off. And I had been having Thanksgiving dinner with my family and friends. It was a group of us for 25 years, without fail, we met for Thanksgiving. And I said, well, maybe I don't need to do that this year. And so the first night, uh, I was with a patient who was dying of AIDS
Mm.
and who had no bladder and bowel control and who was delirious. And I was involved in taking care of his physical needs with a nurse. And I was with him for 24 straight hours. And it was the most spiritual experience I've ever had. So that was my first night there.
You didn't ease into it, huh?
Oh,
I mean, so that was sort of your makeup going into it. So you didn't have any struggles. Would you say that that's something? I mean, there's lots of circumstances here, but like if someone were able to do what you did to volunteer like that, would you recommend that for that? Two questions. Would you recommend it for folks, especially if they're struggling to get perspective? And did it give you any kind of a different perspective on life, on people?
yes, absolutely. I would recommend it. If you had someone who recently died, I would wait 6 months. That's a given.
Right.
But yes, I was, I at that point I had taught at the university for 25 years. I think I was a typical academic, very rigorous, very
Mm.
unemotional, I wouldn't call myself laid back, but enjoying the privileges of academia, all of that stuff.
Mm.
After 8 years of hospice, I think I changed significantly.
Mm.
Not afraid to express my emotions, not afraid to interact, tried to, and I still try to apply the 7 lessons that my patients taught me. Don't always succeed, but I
Sure.
know that becomes a goal for me.
I'm just blown away by that story. I've experienced it, like I said, with my father, and of course, grandmothers, and my younger brother, middle brother. It's obviously they were close to me, and most of them in some ways, and it was difficult, especially my dad. That one left a mark, left a scar for sure. And I'm amazed that you decided to volunteer to help people, that are going through that to get to the other side. Because oh, man, I don't. There's a part of me that feels like I'm getting anxiety because I'm like I would flee from that. Like I wouldn't want any part of that in some ways, but in some ways I'm sure it must have been rewarding and joyful as well, though too. But I would think for me it would make me confront the losses that I've already had, and so I don't know. I admire you, my friend. That's pretty.
Well, I appreciate, the sentiment, but I think you need to look at anything you've ever learned that was significant in your life. You didn't learn it by sitting on a beach in
Mm.
Maui, drinking Mai Tais.
Right.
Yeah. Uh, Learning comes from doing things that are difficult.
Very true.
And you may think that tending to the needs of people who are dying would be the most difficult thing, but it's not.
Mm.
You know, I mean, I've spoken to very few people who, went into hospice training, had the first experience and said, I'm out of here.
Mm.
No, it's always, I can't wait to come back tomorrow.
Wow, that's profound. Do you think it takes a special kind of person to even like consider something like that? Or maybe special is the wrong word, but like, I don't know, unique, a different makeup, maybe?
I think that some people might be drawn to it from who they are, but I think regardless of who you are, the experience is going to shape you.
How
You
could
know,
it not? Yeah.
the people who have the hardest time are those who believe they're Mother Teresa and they're going to go in and save everybody. You
Mm.
know, that's not the type of person that works well in hospice.
Okay, so that is that part of the training, sort of learning how to sit with them and their emotions and their grief.
It is.
Is that the most difficult part of it, to just let someone feel what they're feeling and sort of guide them?
Yes, and also sitting with someone in intense physical pain.
Oh, yeah, I'm sure.
You but when you've had that experience, when you've just witnessed someone's pain, knowing you can't do anything about it other than accept it, it's going to make a very big difference in your life in everything else because you're going to experience emotional pain, physical pain, cognitive pain your entire life. And the older you get, the more you're going to have of that. So you've been there, you've watched what happens when someone goes through that and they can't do anything other than accept it. That's an incredible lesson for life. The
Yeah.
acceptance of what you can't change.
Mm, man. Yeah, no, I mean that's I think that's one of the trickier parts of this whole. I mean, there's so many parts of this divorce thing, but that's one of them, acceptance. And some folks it takes a while to get to. I think in some ways I still have trouble with it, and it's been 4.5 years. There's still some times where I go, I can't fucking believe like this is where I am. I can't believe the person that I stood up in front of all my friends and family and said I do and vows and all that stuff that she's not around anymore. I mean, she chose to leave. And that it's, I think I'm much better. It's been, like I said, 4.5 years. I'm much better than I was, but there are still moments. And I think that's one of the more difficult things is if you have children, like I have to see her all of the time. I have two younger daughters. My youngest is 9. And so I just seen her a few hours ago. So it's tough because it feels like that wound never really heals. It's always sort of being poked at a little bit. I mean, I'm like I said, much better, but it's hard, and that's why I agree with you. And I say all the time, it's not time that heals. It's work. It's not time.
Yeah. There was a famous classical pianist, and I forgot his name. And they were talking to him about what makes him a great pianist. And he said, it's not the notes. Everybody plays the same notes. It's what I do between notes.
Hmm.
And I thought how profound that is. And it's really the same thing I think in life. We go through transitions continually.
True.
Whether it's emotional or cognitive or behavioral, we're going from one point to another. And I think, the way that we define ourselves is how we make it from that one point to the next. So I think the same is true in divorce. You're going from having a certain type of relationship to one that's not there anymore. And how do you make that transition? I think that in terms of looking at my definition of loss and grief, I think that's one way of making that transition, of looking at what you're missing in your life and trying to find something that you could substitute for it. It doesn't always work. I had a very good friend of mine whose son was murdered, and I asked her, "Does the grief ever stop?" And she said, no, it's always there. It just takes different forms, you know. And this was for 20 years. So, I don't want to sound like I'm giving the magic
Right.
formula for how things can
Right.
be. It's one way of thinking about getting over loss.
Well, and I think that's why this podcast exists for a reason, because it is really hard. If it was easy, we wouldn't be having a conversation. And I love the mindset, me personally, of I'm going to try some shit because and not only you might find something that works a few times or one time or 20 times, but then the 21st time or the fifth or whatever, it doesn't. And so if you remain in that mindset of, well, let me try something else. But it's tough to get to that sometimes when you're depressed and just feel like your whole life has been taken from you in a way. It's hard.
There are resources out there.
Sure. Yeah.
One of the things I have a website, it's Stan Goldberg Writer, WRITER.com. And on that website, I have over 200 articles
Hmm.
and most of them deal with these kinds of issues that are very practical, that allow people to figure out how to change their own lives and doesn't cost anything. I
Hmm.
don't sell anything on the website. Yeah. And so that's why the Preventing Senior Moments book,
Hmm.
uh, that there's practical things there. There are ways of practicing how to get over your grief.
Well, yeah, yeah, there are definitely resources, and I think it's it's survivable. Clearly, it's just really difficult. Again, this hospice thing keeps popping in my head, and I'm thinking about, did you have to do any? Were most of the people, because they're in a hospice, were they by themselves, or did you also have family members, and did you have to deal with them and help them too, or was it just the patient?
Oh, yeah. You had some people who were by themselves, had nobody. And the Zen Hospice Center was a very unique place because we worked as a team. And when you did have family members there, you often spent more time with the family members preparing them for the death of their loved one than you did with the person who was dying.
I bet. I bet that sort of, in some ways, would have been more difficult because they're still there and you still have to sort of,
Yes.
tend. I don't know if tend's the right word, but you have to, you know, you have to help them. I mean, that person's gone, so it's, that difficult part is over. But, um, man, yeah, like I said, I admire you. I don't know that I could do it, but I'm curious now. I'm gonna do some looking and see if there are opportunities, and maybe tip my toe in, because I do think it would provide a very valuable perspective to life, to be there at someone's end. And because I wasn't for my fathers, I wasn't for my brothers, I wasn't for any of my grandparents except for, I don't even think I was there for my grandmother's, honest. My mom's mom. I don't think so. So I've experienced the outcome, so to speak, but I've never was in a room surrounding someone who was saying their goodbyes. Man, like I said, it's hard for me to do it with my animals, let alone another human being. I got to think it would be incredibly rewarding in some
It
way.
is, and the moment of death is an incredibly spiritual experience that you really can't describe. And I've talked to people who, who also help people die and were there at the moment of death. And, it's like we all share the exact same experience, no matter who we were with. And it's indescribable, but it's something that leaves its mark on you.
I'm sure.
And you never forget it.
Yeah. Well, to bring this back around, I got one last question that I ask everybody, but I do want to. I know you mentioned your website and everything in the books, but let's do it one more time. Where can people find you and find anything that you've done in your books and things of that nature?
So we'll start with the free stuff. There's videos, there's podcasts, there's also a series on hospice on my website, and that's Stan Goldberg Writer. I always have to spell it out,
Gotcha.
WRITER.com. And there's a number of different books that I've written. And again, if you go on Amazon, the whole list is there. But the latest is Preventing Senior Moments, how to stay alert into your 90s and beyond. There's others there. There's Leaning into Sharp Points, which is a book I wrote for nurturing support for caregivers.
Mm,
And there's a third one, which is Loving, Supporting, and Caring for the Cancer Patient.
mm.
And then the Leaning into Sharp Points, the one, my memoir as a hospice volunteer. So those are all available. Again, you get them at a local bookstore or on Amazon or any of the other online sellers.
Gotcha.
Uh, and so there's also, I think, quite a few podcasts and video casts on YouTube as well.
Gotcha. Well, as you know, the last question I ask everyone is, what words of wisdom would you impart to a man who is just beginning his divorce journey?
Yeah, I would say that, you can choose to grieve or choose to search for happiness. You may not find the happiness that you lost, but it sure is better than sitting on the edge of the dance floor, watching other people dance and wondering what it feels like to be joyful again.
Yeah, man, that's a good one. I tend to go through and pull out these answers and make compilations, and that's definitely. I mean, I get them all, but that I'm looking forward to pulling that one because that's a perfect analogy or perfect description of how you need to move forward. So, thank you so very much for doing this. We will definitely stay in touch, and hopefully we'll have you back on. So, I just thank you so much for doing it. I appreciate it.
Check out hospice.
Yes, sir. I will actually. I will. I'll see what locally there is. I definitely will.
Good. Okay, well, thank you for having me on. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Take care.
Yep. Bye. Thank you so much for watching and or listening. Since my separation in July of 2019, I have done an incredible amount of work on myself. I've had many different therapists, life coaches, and went through different programs. I've taken all that I've learned and put it into my own program called Forged by Fire. If you are interested in having me help you navigate your divorce, please hit my website, risingphoenixdivorcecoach.com. I look forward to working with you.